On Christmas Eve 1979, Soviet transport aircraft began landing at Kabul International Airport at 7-minute intervals, disgorging thousands of paratroopers into the freezing Afghan night, and within 48 hours a sovereign nation's president would be dead, killed not by his enemies but by the very superpower he had begged for help. The man who ordered that invasion, General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, was so physically deteriorated by late 1979 that he could barely read his own speeches. Yet he signed off on a military commitment that would consume the Soviet Union for nearly a decade, kill over 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and wound more than 50,000 others. So why did a global superpower, one that had spent years refusing to intervene, suddenly reverse course and plunge into a war it had been explicitly warned it could not win? To understand that reversal, you have to understand what Afghanistan meant to the Soviet Union long before the first tank crossed the border. Afghanistan was not some distant abstraction. It shared over 2,000 kilometers of border with the Soviet republics of Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. For decades, Moscow had cultivated Afghanistan as a friendly buffer state, pouring in development aid, building roads, training Afghan military officers in Soviet academies, and quietly expanding its influence without needing to fire a shot. By the mid-1970s, Afghanistan received more Soviet foreign aid per capita than almost any other country in the developing world. The Soviets built the Salang Tunnel through the Hindu Kush. They constructed highways linking Kabul to the north, and they trained an entire generation of Afghan elites who spoke Russian, studied Marxism, and looked to Moscow the way an earlier generation of Afghan leaders had looked to London. This was soft power at its most effective. Afghanistan was not a satellite state, but it was close. And then in April 1978, everything changed in a way Moscow neither planned nor wanted. The Sour Revolution of April 27, 1978, was not ordered by the Kremlin. It caught Soviet leadership almost entirely off guard. A faction of the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, the PDPA, launched a military coup against President Mohammad Daoud Khan. Daoud was himself no Democrat. He had seized power in 1973, but he had maintained a careful balancing act between the superpowers. The PDPA officers who overthrew him were ideologically committed communists, many trained in the Soviet Union, and they moved with stunning speed. Tanks rolled through Kabul. Daoud and most of his family were killed in the presidential palace. By the next morning, the PDPA's Nur Mohammad Taraki was declaring a new revolutionary government. Moscow publicly congratulated the new regime. Privately, senior Soviet officials were alarmed. They had not authorized this. They did not trust the PDPA's internal cohesion. And they were right to worry, because the PDPA was not one party, it was two factions locked in a blood feud that would soon drag the Soviet Union into a war. If you find yourself drawn into stories like this, the kind that pull back the curtain on how empires make catastrophic decisions behind closed doors, consider subscribing to this channel. We dig into the mechanics of Soviet and Cold War history, the real documents, the real players, the real miscalculations that shaped the 20th century. One click, and you will not miss what comes next. The two factions within the PDPA were called Khalq and Parcham. Their rivalry was not merely political, it was tribal, linguistic, personal, and vicious. Khalq, led by Taraki and his protégé Hafizullah Amin, drew support primarily from rural Pashtun communities and the military officer corps. Parcham, led by Babrak Karmal, was more urban, more Persian-speaking, and more cautious in its approach to revolution. Within weeks of the Sour Revolution, Taraki and Amin began purging Parchamis from the government. Karmal was sent into diplomatic exile as ambassador to Czechoslovakia. Other Parchamis were arrested, tortured, or killed. The new regime then turned its revolutionary fervor on Afghan society itself, and this is where the catastrophe truly began to accelerate. Taraki and Amin launched radical land reforms, literacy campaigns that were imposed at gunpoint, and sweeping attacks on traditional religious and tribal authority. In a country where over 80% of the population lived in rural areas governed by centuries-old customs, these reforms were not liberation, they were provocation. By the summer of 1978, armed resistance was erupting across the countryside. The Mujahideen rebellion had begun, and it was spreading faster than anyone in Kabul or Moscow had anticipated. Now here is a detail that reshapes the entire narrative. Throughout 1978 and into 1979, Moscow repeatedly refused Afghan requests for direct military intervention. This was not a case of an imperial power eagerly seizing territory. Declassified Politburo records, released after the Soviet collapse, reveal that the Soviet leadership debated the Afghanistan question dozens of times, and the answer kept coming back the same: no. In March 1979, when a major uprising erupted in the western city of Herat, an uprising so severe that Afghan army units mutinied and Soviet military advisors were hunted down and killed, some reportedly paraded through the streets. Taraki desperately called Moscow and begged for Soviet troops. The Politburo convened an emergency session. Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin told Taraki bluntly that sending Soviet forces would be a disaster. Chief of the General Staff Nikolai Ogarkov argued that the Afghan army's problems were political, not military, and that Soviet troops could not solve them. Even KGB chairman Yuri Andropov, who would later become one of the key architects of the invasion, initially opposed it. The consensus in March 1979 was clear and nearly unanimous. The Soviet Union would provide weapons, advisors, and economic aid, but it would not send combat troops. So what changed between March and December? What broke the consensus? The answer lies in a chain of events so tangled with paranoia, personal betrayal, and geopolitical fear that it reads less like rational statecraft and more like a thriller spiraling out of control. At the center of the spiral was Hafizullah Amin. Amin was Taraki's deputy, his former student, and increasingly his rival. Amin was brilliant, ruthless, and obsessively suspicious. He had studied at Columbia University in New York. He spoke fluent English. And this last fact haunted the KGB, because Soviet intelligence began to suspect on thin evidence, but with growing conviction that Amin might be a CIA asset. Whether this suspicion had any basis in reality remains debated by historians to this day. What is not debated is that the suspicion became a driving force in Soviet decision-making. The KGB station in Kabul fed reports back to Moscow portraying Amin as unreliable, as a potential traitor, as a man who might flip Afghanistan into the American camp. And while the KGB was building its case against Amin, Amin was building his own case against everyone around him. In September 1979, the situation exploded. Taraki traveled to Moscow and met with Brezhnev, who reportedly embraced him and urged him to remove Amin from power, or at least to neutralize him by broadening the government. Taraki returned to Kabul and, on September 14th, attempted to have Amin assassinated during a meeting at the presidential palace. The plot failed. Amin's bodyguards opened fire. A shootout erupted inside the palace. Amin survived. Taraki did not survive the aftermath. Within days, Amin seized full control of the government, arrested Taraki, and in early October had him smothered to death with a pillow. The Soviet leadership was stunned. Brezhnev had personally guaranteed Taraki's safety. The killing was not just a political setback, it was perceived in Moscow as a personal humiliation of the General Secretary. And Brezhnev, even in his declining health, was not a man who forgot humiliations. From October through December 1979, the arguments for intervention began to pile up like snow on a mountain slope, each one adding weight until the avalanche became inevitable. Amin consolidated power with a brutality that alarmed even the Soviets. His secret police, the AXA, was conducting mass arrests and executions at Pulichaki prison outside Kabul. Thousands were killed there, many buried in mass graves that would not be fully excavated for decades. The Mujahideen insurgency was spreading. Afghan army desertions were reaching catastrophic levels. Some estimates suggest the army shrank from nearly 100,000 to fewer than 50,000 effective troops in the span of a year. And on the geopolitical stage, events far from Afghanistan were stoking Soviet fears. The Iranian Revolution had toppled the Shah in February 1979, removing a key American ally from the region and creating a volatile Islamist state on the Soviet Union's southwestern flank. Soviet leaders feared that Islamic fundamentalism could spread northward into their own Central Asian republics, with their millions of Muslim citizens. Meanwhile, NATO had just voted in December 1979 to deploy American Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, a decision that inflamed Soviet threat perceptions across the board. The Cold War was entering one of its most dangerous phases, and every move was viewed through the lens of zero-sum competition. Here is an ironic contrast worth pausing on. The United States, which would soon pour billions of dollars into arming the Afghan Mujahideen, had actually begun its covert involvement before the Soviet invasion. Zbigniew Brzezinski, President Carter's national security advisor, later confirmed in a 1998 interview that the CIA had started funneling aid to Afghan rebel groups in July 1979, 6 months before Soviet troops crossed the border. The explicit goal, Brzezinski admitted, was to provoke a Soviet intervention. Whether this covert program actually influenced the Soviet decision remains a matter of historical debate, but the timing is striking. The Soviets were walking into a trap that had already been set, even as they convinced themselves they were acting to prevent one. The final decision was made by a remarkably small group of men. Not the full Politburo, not the Central Committee. A handful of senior leaders, Brezhnev, Andropov, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov, and Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko, made the call in a series of private meetings in late November and early December 1979. Ustinov, the defense minister, had become the most aggressive advocate for intervention. Andropov, who had initially opposed it, had swung around, driven by his intelligence services reports about Amin's alleged American connections and by a broader fear that losing Afghanistan would demonstrate Soviet weakness. Gromyko, the veteran diplomat who had once cautioned restraint, fell in line. Brezhnev, exhausted and medicated, assented. The formal decision was recorded on December 12, 1979, in a handwritten document signed by the inner circle. It was not typed, it was not circulated, it was kept in a safe. The operation was given the codename Storm 333. The invasion unfolded with the precision of a plan that had been rehearsed for months. On December 24th, Soviet airborne troops began landing at Kabul airport. The 40th Army, assembled in the Turkmen and Uzbek SSRs, crossed the Afghan border at the Friendship Bridge over the Amu Darya River. Within days, over 50,000 Soviet troops were on Afghan soil, a number that would eventually swell to over 100,000. But the most dramatic moment came on the evening of December 27th, when Soviet Special Forces, Spetsnaz units from the KGB's Alpha Group, and the GRU stormed the Tajbeg Palace, Amin's fortified residence on the outskirts of Kabul. The assault was preceded by the poisoning of Amin's food by a KGB agent embedded in the palace kitchen. But Amin's personal doctor, unaware of the plot, treated him and saved his life, forcing the Soviets to proceed with the armed assault. The battle for Tajbeg Palace lasted approximately 40 minutes. Soviet troops fought through Amin's presidential guard in room-to-room combat. Amin was killed. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances. Some say he was shot during the fighting, others that he was executed after being found wounded. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. By dawn on December 28th, Babrak Karmal, the Parchami leader, who had been flown in from exile, was installed as the new president and was broadcasting to the Afghan people on Radio Kabul, thanking the Soviet Union for its fraternal assistance. Moscow expected the operation to be short. The plan, insofar as there was a coherent plan, called for Soviet forces to stabilize the new Karmal government, secure major cities and highways, and then withdraw within months, perhaps a year at most. Senior military officers had warned that a prolonged occupation would be disastrous. Marshal Ogakov had told the Politburo that Afghanistan's terrain, its mountains, its vast ungoverned spaces, its fiercely independent tribal populations, made it a graveyard for conventional armies. The British had learned this lesson in the 19th century, suffering one of their worst military disasters in the 1842 retreat from Kabul, where an entire army of over 16,000 was annihilated. But the political leadership overruled the military's caution. The generals were told to execute the plan, not to question it. And so the Soviet 40th Army found itself occupying a country that did not want to be occupied, fighting an insurgency that grew stronger with every passing month. The war that followed was a slow-motion catastrophe defined by asymmetric warfare decades before that term entered the popular vocabulary. Soviet forces controlled the cities, the major roads, and the airfields. The Mujahideen controlled everything else, the mountains, the villages, the night. Soviet tactics relied on overwhelming firepower. Helicopter gunships, carpet bombing, artillery barrages, and the deliberate destruction of rural infrastructure to deny the insurgents support. The scale of devastation was staggering. Entire valleys were depopulated. Irrigation systems that had sustained agriculture for centuries were obliterated. Millions of landmines were sown across the countryside. Afghanistan would remain one of the most heavily mined countries on earth for decades afterward. The human cost was borne overwhelmingly by Afghan civilians. Estimates of Afghan deaths during the Soviet occupation range from 600,000 to 2 million. Over 5 million Afghans fled the country, creating one of the largest refugee populations in the world, concentrated in Pakistan and Iran. For the Soviet soldiers, many of them 18 and 19-year-old conscripts from across the vast USSR, the war was a nightmare of heat, altitude, ambush, and disease. They called Afghanistan the furnace, hepatitis and typhoid swept through Soviet units. Drug use became endemic. Morale collapsed. The Afghan insurgents, armed first with captured Soviet weapons and then increasingly with sophisticated arms supplied by the CIA, Pakistan's ISI, Saudi Arabia, and China, proved impossible to defeat. The introduction of American-made Stinger shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles in 1986 was a particular turning point, neutralizing the Soviet advantage in helicopter warfare and forcing a fundamental change in tactics. A single Stinger missile, costing roughly $35,000, could destroy a multi-million-dollar Mi-24 Hind gunship. The math of attrition favored the insurgents overwhelmingly. Back in Moscow, the war became the issue that could not be discussed. Soviet media reported almost nothing about the conflict for years. Casualties were returned home in sealed zinc coffins. The soldiers called them Cargo 200, with families forbidden from holding public funerals or mentioning the cause of death. The phrase fulfilling their internationalist duty became a grim euphemism that everyone understood and no one was permitted to challenge. But the silence could not hold forever. As the 1980s progressed, the war's costs, economic, military, diplomatic, and moral, accumulated beyond the capacity of official silence to contain them. The Soviet Union was spending billions of rubles annually on a war it was not winning. Its international reputation was shattered. The 1980 Moscow Olympics were boycotted by over 60 nations in protest. The United Nations General Assembly voted overwhelmingly, year after year, to condemn the invasion. Even Allied communist states offered only tepid support. The generational shift in Soviet leadership proved decisive. Brezhnev died in November 1982. Andropov succeeded him but was already gravely ill and died in February 1984. Konstantin Chernenko, another aging apparatchik, lasted barely a year before dying in March 1985. Then came Mikhail Gorbachev, 54 years old, energetic, reform-minded, and determined to extricate the Soviet Union from what he privately called a bleeding wound. Gorbachev understood something his predecessors had refused to acknowledge. The war could not be won militarily, and the longer it continued, the more it undermined every other objective of Soviet policy, from arms control negotiations with the United States to economic reform at home. But withdrawal was politically explosive. The Soviet military establishment resisted. Hardliners in the party argued that retreat would embolden enemies and humiliate the motherland. Gorbachev had to navigate these pressures while simultaneously reforming a sclerotic system that was crumbling from within. The Geneva Accords, signed on April 14, 1988, provided the diplomatic framework for withdrawal. The Soviet Union committed to a complete pullout within 9 months. The withdrawal began on May 15, 1988, and the last Soviet soldier to cross back over the Friendship Bridge into the USSR was Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, commander of the 40th Army, who walked across on February 15, 1989, reportedly pausing to look back at Afghanistan one last time. The image was broadcast across the Soviet Union. It was meant to signal dignity and closure. In reality, it signaled neither. The consequences radiated outward for decades and have not fully subsided. For Afghanistan, the Soviet withdrawal did not bring peace. The Mujahideen factions, united only by their opposition to the Soviets, turned on each other and on the Najibullah government that Moscow left behind. Najibullah held on until 1992, when his government collapsed. Civil war consumed the country. From the chaos emerged the Taliban, a movement born in the refugee camps of Pakistan and the madrasas funded by Saudi money, which seized Kabul in 1996 and imposed a regime of medieval severity. The Taliban provided sanctuary to Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, creating the conditions for the September 11th attacks and the American invasion that followed in 2001. The American war in Afghanistan would last 20 years, becoming the longest war in United States history, and it ended in August 2021 with a chaotic withdrawal from Kabul that echoed, with eerie precision, the images of imperial overreach and strategic failure that had defined the Soviet experience. For the Soviet Union itself, Afghanistan was not the sole cause of collapse, but it was an accelerant. The war consumed resources that were desperately needed for an economy already stagnating. It demoralized a generation of young men who returned home to a society that did not want to acknowledge their sacrifice. The Afghan veterans became a lost generation, struggling with trauma, addiction, and social alienation in a country that had no framework for understanding or treating what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. The war discredited the Soviet system's claims of moral superiority and peaceful intentions. It demonstrated to Soviet citizens and to the world that the gap between the regime's rhetoric and its reality was not a crack, but a chasm. When the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, just 9 months after the last Soviet soldier left Afghanistan, the connection was not coincidental. The same system that could not win in the mountains of the Hindu Kush could not hold its empire in Eastern Europe. The same leadership paralysis that prolonged the war for nearly a decade was the same paralysis that failed to adapt to the economic and political crises, tearing the Union apart from within. There is a broader pattern here that transcends the specifics of Soviet and Afghan history, and it is worth naming plainly. Great powers do not usually invade other countries because they are strong and confident. They invade because they are afraid of losing influence, afraid of appearing weak, afraid of dominoes falling in directions they cannot control. The Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan was driven not by a desire for conquest, but by a cascading series of fears. Fear of losing a client state, fear of American encirclement, fear of Islamic radicalism spreading to Soviet Central Asia, fear of being seen as impotent in the eyes of the world. Each fear fed the next. Each decision to escalate closed off the possibility of retreat. And by the time the leadership recognized the scale of the mistake, the institutional and political costs of admitting error were so enormous that it was easier to keep fighting than to stop. This is not a uniquely Soviet pathology. It is a recurring pattern in the behavior of empires, and it has repeated itself with variations. From the British in Afghanistan to the Americans in Vietnam to the Americans again in Afghanistan, across centuries and across ideologies. The mountains of Afghanistan have a way of outlasting the armies that march into them. The empires come with their certainties and their technologies and their geopolitical calculations, and the mountains remain. The people who live in those mountains have been fighting foreign invaders for so long that resistance is not a policy choice, it is a cultural inheritance. The Soviets learned this at the cost of 15,000 dead, hundreds of thousands wounded and traumatized, billions of rubles squandered, and ultimately the collapse of the state itself. The zinc coffins came home, the empire came apart, and the mountains endured.